Britain has produced some of the most instantly recognizable faces in the history of entertainment, and a surprising number of them owe that recognition to something real, medical, and completely unplanned. Not makeup, not prosthetics. Genuine, documented physical features caused by genetics, accidents, or illness that ended up defining entire careers, features that no studio makeup department could have ever manufactured on purpose, even if they'd wanted to. Some of these people were born with a condition that made them instantly recognizable. Others had it forced on them in a single unexpected moment. A punch, a crash, a botched surgery, and simply learned to work with whatever their body handed them afterward. These are 10 old British celebrities with the weirdest verified physical features in entertainment history, starting with the man whose eyes might be the single strangest feature on this entire list. If you're into stories like this, hit subscribe and turn on notifications right now before we get into it. Alright, let's get started. Number 1. Marty Feldman. Marty Feldman's enormous, misaligned, bulging eyes turned him into one of the most recognizable comic faces Britain ever produced, most famously as Igor in Young Frankenstein, where his eyes seemed to look in two completely different directions at the same time. The look wasn't a special effect or a piece of clever makeup. Feldman developed thyroid eye disease, also called Graves' ophthalmopathy, an autoimmune condition that causes the tissue behind the eyes to swell and physically push the eyeballs forward. The condition worsened significantly following a car accident in his late 20s, and Feldman underwent surgery specifically intended to correct the resulting misalignment. The operation failed to deliver the results doctors had promised him, and Feldman was left with the permanently bulging, wandering eyes that would go on to define his entire on-screen persona. Doctors at the time genuinely believed the surgery would restore something close to a normal appearance, making the permanent result as much a surprise to Feldman's own medical team as it eventually became to the millions of fans who came to know his face as one of comedy's most unmistakable trademarks. He later joked in interviews that he was the only actor in Britain capable of watching two different conversations happening on opposite sides of a room at the same time, turning an unplanned medical outcome into one of comedy's most genuinely iconic looks. Feldman himself attributed the underlying hyperthyroid condition to sheer overwork, describing years spent writing dozens of television and radio scripts a week under constant, punishing deadline pressure as the likely trigger for the whole chain of events. He spent 14 years expecting his eyes to eventually settle back to normal, exactly as doctors had assured him they would following the surgery. And when they never did, he simply built an entire career around the permanent result instead, using his own eyes as one of his most reliable comic tools for the rest of his working life. Before his eyes became his defining feature, Feldman had already established himself as one of British comedy's most in-demand writers, contributing to shows long before he ever stepped in front of a camera himself. Directors on Young Frankenstein reportedly built entire visual gags specifically around the natural misalignment of his eyes, camera angles, and reaction shots, written with the express purpose of taking advantage of a medical condition that, on paper, should have limited his casting options rather than expanding them into some of the most memorable comic performances of the entire decade. Feldman's condition also affected the way cinematographers had to light and frame his close-ups throughout his career, since a straight-on shot could sometimes make the misalignment look more dramatic than directors intended for a given scene. Rather than treating this as a limitation, several collaborators later said working around Feldman's eyes actually pushed them toward more inventive camera work than they might have otherwise used, turning a technical challenge into some of the most visually distinctive comedy sequences of the 1970s. Feldman also worked as a director in his own right later in his career, giving him direct control over exactly how his own eyes were framed and lit on screen, a level of creative authority few performers with any kind of distinctive physical feature ever managed to secure over their own image. He remained close friends with several of the doctors who had treated him over the years, reportedly sending them tickets to his premieres as a running joke about the surgery that never quite went according to plan, but ended up making his career anyway. Number 2. David Bowie. David Bowie's eyes became one of the most instantly recognizable features of any rock star in history, widely believed by fans for decades to be two entirely different colors. The real explanation traces back to a schoolyard fight in 1962, when a 15-year-old Bowie was punched in the left eye by his close friend George Underwood during an argument over a girl. The blow scratched Bowie's eyeball and paralyzed the muscle responsible for contracting his iris, leaving his left pupil permanently dilated in a condition known as anisocoria. Both of Bowie's irises were actually the exact same pale blue-gray color, but the permanently wide, fixed pupil in his left eye created the illusion of an entirely different, darker shade, an effect that became especially pronounced under stage lighting. Bowie required 4 months of hospital treatment after the injury, and doctors were genuinely unsure for a time whether he would retain any usable vision in the eye at all. A lengthy and uncertain recovery that kept the 15-year-old out of school for the better part of an entire term, while surgeons worked to save what vision they could. Bowie and Underwood remained close friends for the rest of Bowie's life, and Underwood went on to become a respected artist in his own right, eventually designing album artwork for his old friend decades after the injury that had reshaped his face. Bowie later said, "The accident gave him a strange, genuinely useful advantage in an industry built almost entirely around image, turning what could have been a disfiguring injury into one of the most talked about features of his entire career." The injury also left Bowie with permanently impaired depth perception, a lasting physical consequence that rarely gets mentioned alongside the more famous story about his supposedly mismatched eye color, since most retellings focus entirely on the striking visual effect rather than the genuine vision impairment that came along with it. Photographers who worked with him throughout his career often noted that the effect became more or less pronounced depending on the lighting setup, something Bowie reportedly grew skilled at using deliberately to heighten the otherworldly persona he cultivated across decades of constantly shifting stage characters. Makeup artists who worked on his various stage personas, from Ziggy Stardust onward, often said Bowie's naturally striking eyes meant they needed far less work around that part of his face than most performers required, since the pupil alone already did most of the visual heavy lifting. Fans and journalists spent decades speculating about the supposed heterochromia, and Bowie reportedly found a certain amusement in never fully correcting the misconception in interviews, letting the more dramatic version of the story circulate largely unchallenged for most of his career. If you've made it this far, that's exactly the kind of detail we dig up on this channel every single time. So if you haven't already, now's a good moment to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications before we keep going. Number 3. Freddie Mercury. Freddie Mercury's powerful, 4-octave vocal range made him one of the greatest live performers of his generation, and his distinctive, slightly protruding smile became just as recognizable as his voice. Mercury was born with a rare condition called hyperdontia, which gave him 4 extra teeth growing in his upper jaw, bringing his total tooth count to 36 instead of the usual 32. The extra teeth caused significant crowding along his upper jaw and produced the pronounced overbite that became one of his most talked about physical features, a detail his own bandmates rarely discussed openly with him, aware from early on just how sensitive he was about it despite the confidence he projected everywhere else. Mercury reportedly had the opportunity to have the condition corrected surgically at multiple points throughout his career, but consistently declined, worried that altering the structure of his mouth might affect the voice that had made him famous in the first place, a decision he apparently never once seriously reconsidered, despite the procedure becoming increasingly routine and low risk as the decades went on. He once explained that he simply didn't dare risk it, since he had no way of knowing for certain whether fixing his teeth might also change the sound that had built his entire career. While there's no solid scientific evidence that his extra teeth actually expanded his vocal range in any measurable way, Mercury clearly believed the connection was real enough to avoid surgery entirely, and few would argue that whatever he did over the following 2 decades of performing wasn't working extraordinarily well exactly as it was. Bandmates and producers who worked closely with Mercury throughout his career often said he was privately self-conscious about the overbite in everyday life, frequently covering his mouth with his hand during interviews and casual conversation, even as he performed with total, uninhibited confidence in front of stadium crowds night after night, a striking contradiction between the guarded, private man and the fearless showman millions of fans thought they knew from his performances alone. That contrast between private self-consciousness and public fearlessness became one of the more quietly fascinating aspects of a performer, otherwise known almost entirely for his complete lack of inhibition on stage. Dentists who have studied his case since his death have noted that hyperdontia of this severity typically causes noticeable speech difficulties in most people who have it, making Mercury's precise, powerful vocal delivery all the more remarkable given the extra crowding inside his mouth, a level of clarity that speech specialists say would normally require years of dedicated training to achieve even without any dental complication at all. Some fans and biographers have suggested his instinct to cover his smile in photographs actually became part of his visual signature over time, an accidental habit that ended up shaping the way an entire generation of fans pictured him even off stage, appearing in countless candid shots taken over 2 decades of touring, interviews, and studio sessions. Number 4. Terry Thomas. Terry Thomas built an entire comic persona around playing caddish, upper-class English bounders in dozens of British comedies, and the most memorable part of that persona was the wide gap between his 2 front teeth. The condition is called a dental diastema, and Terry Thomas actually tried to disguise it early in his career before eventually realizing the gap could work in his favor rather than against him. He leaned into the feature so completely that he added a hyphen to his own stage name, joking that it represented the very same gap that had become his trademark. The look became so specifically associated with him that it eventually gave its name to an unrelated medical term entirely. In orthopedic medicine, doctors still refer to a particular pattern of separation visible on a wrist X-ray as the Terry Thomas sign, a direct reference to the actor's famous gap, named by radiologists, who apparently couldn't resist the resemblance once they saw it. It's a rare case of a physical feature becoming so culturally embedded that it outlived the man's own career, still referenced today by doctors who may have never actually seen one of his films, simply because his gap-toothed grin was distinctive enough to become permanent medical shorthand. Terry Thomas built his entire screen persona, the cheerfully caddish English toff, around a combination of that gap-toothed smile, a well-groomed mustache, and a cigarette holder, cultivating a look so specific that it became instantly parodiable across British comedy for decades afterward. Even performers who never met him or saw his films directly grew up recognizing the type he'd essentially invented, a testament to just how thoroughly one small dental gap ended up shaping an entire archetype of British comic acting. His Hollywood roles later in his career leaned even harder into the gap, as a signifier of a certain kind of untrustworthy English charm, and American audiences unfamiliar with his earlier British work quickly came to associate that specific smile with exactly the sort of raffish, mildly disreputable character he'd spent years perfecting back home. Radiologists who continue using the Terry Thomas sign in modern medical training rarely have any real familiarity with the actor's actual filmography, and more than one medical student has reportedly been surprised to learn the term traces back to a real, working comic actor rather than some generic archetype invented purely for teaching purposes. Some textbooks still include a still photograph of the actor's grinning face directly alongside the corresponding wrist X-ray, an unusual pairing of Hollywood and diagnostic radiology that continues confusing first-year medical students decades after his own films stopped being widely shown on television, a genuinely unusual crossover between vintage British comedy and modern orthopedic teaching material. Number 5. Warwick Davis. Warwick Davis has spent more than 4 decades building one of the most prolific acting careers in British film, appearing in everything from Star Wars to the Harry Potter series. Davis was born with spondyloepiphyseal dysplasia congenita, a rare genetic bone growth disorder that results in short stature, along with a notably short trunk and neck, while the hands and feet typically remain closer to average proportions. The condition limits Davis's height to around 3 feet 6 inches, and he was cast almost by accident at the age of 11, when his grandmother heard a radio appeal specifically looking for performers under 4 feet tall to play Ewoks in Return of the Jedi. Davis auditioned as a massive fan of the franchise and landed the role, launching a career that has continued steadily ever since, making him one of the highest-grossing supporting actors in film history when the box office totals of every production he's appeared in are added together. A statistic that still surprises people who assume such rankings are dominated purely by leading actors rather than supporting performers cast across franchise after franchise for decades. Rather than limiting his opportunities, the genetic condition that shaped his stature effectively launched an entire career, one that has now spanned generations of major franchise films and shows no real signs of slowing down even decades after that first Ewok audition. Davis has spoken openly for years about growing up with the condition long before he ever set foot on a film set, and he has used his considerable platform within the industry to advocate for better representation of performers with dwarfism, pushing back against roles that reduce short-statured actors to little more than a visual gag. His son Harrison was born with a different form of the same broader category of skeletal condition, and Davis has spoken candidly about navigating fatherhood while helping his own child understand a genetic reality he already knew intimately from his own life. Davis has also worked as a director and producer in his own right in recent years, using the industry knowledge he built up over 4 decades in front of the camera to help shape opportunities for a new generation of short-statured performers who might otherwise have faced the same limited casting options he encountered as a child actor, breaking into the business back in the early 1980s, roles that, at the time, were rarely written as anything beyond a costume filled by whoever happened to fit inside it. Number 6. Joseph Merrick. Joseph Merrick, widely known by the stage name given to him during his lifetime, the Elephant Man, became one of the most famous figures in Victorian Britain due to severe, progressive physical deformities that began appearing in early childhood. For well over a century, doctors and the public alike assumed Merrick suffered from neurofibromatosis type 1, a genetic disorder that causes tumors to grow along nerve tissue. In 1986, geneticists re-examined the historical evidence and concluded that Merrick's specific combination of symptoms didn't actually match neurofibromatosis at all. His case lacked the characteristic skin markings typically seen in that condition, and the overall severity and specific pattern of his deformities pointed instead toward Proteus syndrome, an extraordinarily rare disorder that causes irregular, overgrown tissue in various parts of the body. Despite the corrected diagnosis being established for decades now, popular media and even some medical literature still occasionally repeat the older, inaccurate neurofibromatosis explanation, a confusion that persists largely because Merrick's case predates modern genetic testing entirely, leaving researchers to work backward from historical photographs, plaster casts, and skeletal remains, rather than any direct genetic sample. Merrick spent years being exhibited as a curiosity before eventually finding refuge at the London hospital under the care of surgeon Frederick Treves, and his story has since become one of the most studied and referenced cases in the entire history of medical genetics, a permanent record of a condition so rare that scientists are still working to fully understand it more than a century after his death. Contemporary accounts from those who actually met Merrick during his final years at the hospital consistently described a thoughtful, well-read, and gentle man whose intelligence and sensitivity stood in sharp contrast to the crude, dehumanizing way he had been marketed during his years being exhibited to paying audiences, a contrast that Frederick Treves himself wrote about extensively, describing his own gradual realization that the man he'd initially assumed to be simple-minded was, in fact, articulate, self-aware, and deeply thoughtful about his own extraordinary circumstances. His story has since been adapted into stage plays and films, most famously the 1980 movie The Elephant Man, which introduced his life to millions of people who had never previously heard the full, more complicated truth behind the exploitative stage name given to him decades before medical science ever fully understood what he'd actually been living with. Merrick's skeleton and a small collection of personal items are still preserved and studied at the Royal London Hospital today, and researchers continue periodically revisiting his case using whatever new genetic and imaging technology becomes available, hoping to eventually pin down the exact genetic mutation responsible for a syndrome so rare that only a handful of confirmed cases exist anywhere in modern medical literature. Proteus syndrome remains so uncommon that even now, well over a century after Merrick's death. Most practicing physicians will go their entire careers without ever encountering a single confirmed case of it in a living patient. A rarity that keeps Merrick's own preserved remains one of the single most valuable reference cases available to researchers studying the condition anywhere in the world. Number 7. Ken Dodd. Ken Dodd became one of Britain's most beloved comedians, famous for his tickling stick, his wild, unkempt hair, and above all, his distinctive protruding front teeth, a feature so central to his act that it became nearly as recognizable as his jokes themselves. Unlike some of the other names on this list, Dodd's teeth weren't something he was simply born with. As a young boy of 7, Dodd was reportedly dared by friends to ride his bicycle with his eyes closed, and the resulting crash left him with facial injuries that permanently altered the position of his front teeth, pushing them into the protruding shape that would eventually become one of comedy's most recognizable smiles. Rather than something to hide, the accident-altered teeth became inseparable from his stage persona for the rest of his career, exaggerated further through his own expressive performing style, and instantly recognizable the moment he stepped in front of an audience. Dodd went on to perform well into his 80s, one of the longest careers of any British comedian of his era, built in part around a physical feature that had started as nothing more than a childhood dare gone wrong. Dodd's live shows became legendary for their sheer length, often running 4 or 5 hours without an intermission, and audiences who came expecting a quick laugh instead found themselves watching a performer who seemed almost physically incapable of running out of material or energy, a stamina that seemed only to grow more remarkable as he continued performing well past the age when most of his contemporaries had long since retired from the stage entirely. Colleagues who worked alongside him for decades often said his distinctive smile, the very one born from a childhood accident, became something close to a comfort to loyal fans, a signal the moment he appeared on stage that they were in for hours of genuinely committed entertainment. Dodd's hometown of Liverpool embraced him so thoroughly over the decades that a statue depicting him, alongside his own tickling stick, now stands in the city's train station, immortalizing a smile that started more than 80 years earlier as nothing more than the aftermath of one badly judged childhood dare on a bicycle. Local dentists in Liverpool have reportedly fielded questions for decades, from tourists genuinely curious whether Dodd's teeth were natural or the product of some elaborate comic prosthetic, a question that always seemed to amuse Dodd himself whenever it was relayed back to him. Number 8. Boris Karloff. Boris Karloff, born William Henry Pratt in South London, became the definitive face of Frankenstein's monster and one of horror cinema's most enduring stars. Long before any of that, Karloff dealt with a persistent lisp that lasted throughout his entire life and career, a speech pattern he learned to manage but never fully eliminated, even in his most famous roles. Karloff also struggled financially for years before his breakthrough, taking on brutal manual labor jobs across Canada and the United States just to survive between acting gigs, including laying railway track, digging ditches, and shoveling coal for a Canadian electric railway company. That years of grueling physical work left him with chronic back problems that stayed with him for the rest of his life, pain that reportedly worsened considerably during his years playing Frankenstein's monster, a role that required him to wear extremely heavy costuming and prosthetics for hours at a stretch. Karloff rarely complained publicly about the physical toll, continuing to work steadily into his final years, despite the combination of a lifelong lisp and a back permanently damaged by manual labor performed decades before he ever became one of the most famous faces in horror history. Despite chronic pain that worsened significantly with age, Karloff continued accepting demanding physical roles well into his 70s, reportedly needing back braces and other support equipment on set that rarely made it into any official studio publicity material at the time. Colleagues who worked with him in his final years often described a performer who simply refused to let decades-old injuries from a completely different chapter of his life stop him from continuing to work in the industry he'd fought so hard to break into in the first place. Karloff continued acting almost until the very end, appearing in projects well into the final year of his life, despite a body that had, by that point, been carrying the weight of both a childhood lisp and a manual laborer's back for the better part of 8 decades. Speech therapists who have studied recordings of Karloff's voice over the years have noted that his particular lisp likely stemmed from a slight physical difference in his palate, a detail that went undiagnosed and untreated throughout his childhood in an era when speech therapy for children was virtually non-existent, leaving him to simply learn how to work around it well enough to build one of the most successful voice-driven careers in the entire history of horror cinema. Karloff came from a large family with several brothers who worked in the British diplomatic service, and biographers have noted the odd irony that the one son who couldn't quite master conventional public speaking ended up more famous worldwide than any of his more polished siblings, several of whom reportedly disapproved for years of his decision to pursue acting instead of following the family's more traditional, respectable career path. Number 9. Roald Dahl. Roald Dahl is remembered today primarily as one of the most successful children's authors in publishing history. But before any of his books were written, he served as a fighter pilot for the Royal Air Force during the Second World War. In September of 1940, Dahl's plane ran low on fuel over the western desert of Libya, and during the resulting crash landing, he struck a boulder that fractured his skull and drove his nose backward into his face with tremendous force. Dahl was temporarily blinded by the impact and had to be pulled from the wreckage moments before the aircraft caught fire completely. He spent the following 5 months recovering in a military hospital in Alexandria, undergoing extensive reconstructive surgery to rebuild his nose, a process that permanently altered its shape and left him with severe headaches that continued to trouble him for the rest of his life. His face, and in particular the reconstructed nose so many people recognize from later photographs, was entirely the product of wartime reconstructive surgery performed under difficult conditions rather than his original, unaltered appearance. The crash and its long recovery ended up shaping the rest of Dahl's life in an unexpected way as well, since it was during his convalescence that he wrote his very first published piece, setting him on the path toward the writing career that eventually made him famous. The chronic headaches that resulted from his facial injuries stayed with Dahl for the rest of his life, and biographers have noted that his later fiction, often filled with grotesque, exaggerated physical transformations and larger-than-life villains, may have drawn at least some inspiration from his own experience of having his face permanently and dramatically altered in a single violent moment, a theory Dahl himself never explicitly confirmed, but never firmly denied, either whenever interviewers raised it. Dahl rarely spoke in detail about the crash and public appearances later in life, though photographs from before and after the accident make the physical change to his nose immediately obvious to anyone who compares them side by side. Military doctors in Alexandria had initially given Dahl only slim odds of ever recovering his sight fully, and the months he spent in that hospital bed, unsure whether his vision would return at all, reportedly gave him ample time to begin turning the vivid, occasionally frightening images running through his own head into the kind of storytelling that would eventually define his entire second career, long after his days flying RAF fighter planes had come to an end. He later described the entire ordeal, in typically understated fashion, as simply the moment his life quietly changed direction, trading the cockpit of a fighter plane for a writing desk almost entirely by accident. Number 10. Oliver Reed. Oliver Reed built a reputation as one of British cinema's most intense leading men, appearing in films like Oliver and The Three Musketeers, and off-screen, he became just as famous for his hard-living, frequently violent personal life. In 1964, Reed got into an altercation with a group of men at a London nightclub, and when he stepped away from the confrontation, he was attacked with broken bottles that tore deep gashes across his face. The injuries required 63 stitches to close, leaving Reed with a permanent, visible scar that he initially feared might end his acting career altogether before he came before the camera again. Instead, the scar became simply one more part of his rugged, dangerous on-screen image, adding a genuine, unmanufactured edge to a persona that was already built around raw physical intensity. Reed continued working steadily for decades afterward, the scar becoming such a permanent fixture of his face that few of his later fans ever knew the specific, violent story behind exactly how he got it. Directors who cast Reed in later decades often specifically wanted the scar visible on camera rather than covered with makeup, recognizing that it added a layer of authentic menace to his already formidable screen presence that no amount of prosthetic work could have convincingly replicated. Reed himself reportedly grew to see the injury as something close to a badge of honor over the years, a physical reminder of the reckless, hard-living reputation that had, for better or worse, become just as central to his public identity as any of the films he actually appeared in. The 1964 attack was serious enough that doctors at the time genuinely worried about permanent nerve damage to the surrounding facial muscles, and Reed spent weeks recovering before he was cleared to return to work at all, a recovery period that gave him ample time to consider whether his career in front of the camera might already be over before it had really had the chance to fully begin. Makeup artists on later productions reportedly developed specific techniques for lighting around the scar, depending on whether a director wanted it emphasized or softened for a particular role, treating it as a genuine tool of the trade rather than simply a flaw to be hidden, a level of professional accommodation rarely extended to an injury that had, decades earlier, come from nothing more noble than a drunken nightclub brawl. Reed's own family reportedly grew used to hearing wildly different versions of the fight retold over the years, since Reed himself was rarely shy about embellishing the specifics whenever a journalist or a fellow drinking companion asked him to recount exactly how he'd gotten 10 completely different British celebrities, 10 completely different medical and accidental explanations, and 10 features that turned out to be far stranger and far more real than most of the stories that usually circulate about famous faces. Some of these conditions were present from birth, like Freddie Mercury's extra teeth, Warwick Davis's skeletal condition, and the disorder that shaped Joseph Merrick's entire life. Others came from accidents, wartime injuries, or a single violent night that none of these people ever planned for or expected, from Bowie's schoolyard punch to Dahl's desert plane crash, to the bottle that scarred Oliver Reed's face for the rest of his career. What connects every name on this list is that British entertainment, an industry that has spent generations selling audiences a very particular, polished idea of what a star is supposed to look like, ended up building some of its most enduring careers around faces that never once matched that expectation. None of these 10 hid what made them different, and in nearly every single case, the feature that could have ended a career before it started instead became the exact detail audiences never forgot. It's genuinely worth remembering, too, that not one of these 10 performers ever planned for any of it in advance. Feldman never expected a failed surgery to reshape his entire comic identity. Bowie never asked for a schoolyard fight to alter his eye forever. Dahl certainly never wanted a plane crash in the Libyan desert to rebuild his face before he'd even published a single word. What actually happened to each of them was, in every case, completely out of their own control, and the industry around them simply had the good sense to recognize that a genuinely unusual face, paired with real talent, was worth more than a manufactured one ever could be. Proof, in the end, that sometimes the weirdest thing about a person's appearance is exactly what makes them impossible to forget.